Happy New Year, everyone, and welcome to Green Builder Media's Impact Series, Game Changers in Sustainability. Today we have Alison Taylor, Vice President of Sustainability Americas for Siemens Corporation. She's going to take a look at cities and the vital role they play in a sustainable future. Today's webinar would not be possible without the support of our sponsor. And our sponsor today is the Green Builder Coalition. The Green Builder Coalition offers in-depth research, discounted education, and advocacy resources. The coalition is also the home of the Green Building Administrator, the industry's only software program that allows you to compare 3 national green building programs. For more information on our membership levels, please visit greenbuildercoalition.org/join. I'm Mike Collignan, Executive Director of the Green Builder Coalition, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. Now, I hope that during the course of today's presentation, you'll submit questions for our guest. To do so, please use the small box at the bottom of the Q&A. I'll review those questions and pose them to Alison during the Q&A time set aside near the end of the webcast. Now to introduce today's speaker. Alison Taylor is the Vice President of Sustainability Americas for Siemens Corporation. As such, she drives the company's sustainability program. Alison has represented Siemens' position on environmental issues with Congress and the executive branch, and she's developed projects to focus on air quality, emissions, water quality, industrial pollution, and climate change. Prior to joining Siemens, Alison was chief counsel to the U.S. Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works and counsel to the U.S. House Committee on Energy and Commerce. Alison graduated with a BS from Duke University and a JD from the University of Denver. Our host today is the always inquisitive Ron Jones, president of Green Builder Media and board chairman and co-founder of the Green Builder Coalition. Take it away, my friend.
Thank you, Mike, and I am inquisitive today because this whole subject of green cities is fascinating to me. Very nice to speak with you again, Alison. Thank you for joining us.
Well, it's great to be here. Good afternoon. Thank you.
Tell us why cities are an important subject matter when we think about the broader element of sustainability in the future.
Well, the mega trend that a lot of people are paying attention to, cities included, is the mega trend of urbanization. So many people globally are moving into urban areas. About 82% of Americans, 81% of Canadians are urban dwellers now, and that trend is increasing. And so cities are really looking at their long-term planning in order to accommodate growing populations as well as populations that are living longer. There's also the megatrend of demographic change. So as more people are moving into urban areas, urban infrastructure, which is already stressed, is going to have to accommodate those people. There's going to have to be access to transportation, to health care, and certainly there is another megatrend at play here, which is that of climate change. And so cities are looking at long-term planning also through the lens of climate adaptation and how they can become resilient to a variety of changes that may be brought about by natural or man-made causes. As as we say, populations are increasing and people are living longer. So there are major challenges for cities. And certainly a business like Siemens, infrastructure businesses, technology businesses, all kinds of providers for cities are seeing great challenges and opportunities as well.
In that context, what are some of the greatest challenges that you see in your day-to-day work, and who are your strongest proponents, and also where do you have the greatest hurdles to clear?
Well, I think in day-to-day work, and particularly with cities, one great thing is that cities are really paying attention to sustainability. A number of them have sustainability officers, oftentimes sitting in the mayor's office, so they really have the ear of the leadership of the city, and they're real key decision makers as well. And they're putting resources to sustainability. They're putting together very detailed plans with ambitious goals. Philadelphia is a great example of this. New York with Plan NYC is a great example. Chicago, and certainly smaller cities as well, not just the mega cities. But they all are looking at some similar challenges, I would say. One is certainly money. The economy has been difficult for business and for cities in the past few years, but cities in particular are also looking at the need to make great expenditures to expand and improve upon their aging infrastructure. And they're looking to do this in creative ways, perhaps with performance contracting or creative financing. But we hear this at the top of the list of almost every city. How can we afford to expand our infrastructure or just repair it? That's a tremendous challenge for them. Cities certainly have a shorter window of planning because their leadership turns over more quickly, even than some to the federal government. And so the mayors come in, they've got a very tight time frame to really deliver. And city citizens, their voters, watch them very carefully, expect them to deliver very quickly. And people can be very passionate about the livability of their city. So we see a variety of challenges unique to cities, but what's in common for most of the cities is they have such a tight time frame to respond.
I would assume, too, that there is an inherent conflict between the interests at the state level for policymakers compared to individual cities. I'm thinking about the fact that in states where, for example, the fossil fuel industry is an important part of the state's economy and so forth, and it has considerable influence in state policy and how regulations from the federal level are enacted and so forth. And the constituencies would be different for the person who is a public servant at the state level versus the city. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's absolutely accurate. And I think there's a fair amount of tension oftentimes in where those resources that may be coming from the federal government but may be allocated by the states go. Smaller cities will often say it's just the big cities that get the attention and get those resources, and the larger cities obviously have growing populations and pretty tremendous needs as well. So there can be a real tension within a state, and the state government's trying to figure out how to fairly allocate resources, and that pot of resources, of course, is also shrinking. Um, and the state legislatures and the agenda for the state is not always, of course, the same as that of the city, and not all cities are the same within the state either. There are states where policies, for instance, on renewable energy development have been put forth at a state level, and the cities have the state support for renewable policies that they may want to enact on the city level. But then there are also examples of states that have an absolutely different view about, let's say, energy efficiency in buildings. And they've actually enacted legislation that would prohibit their cities from requiring energy efficient buildings within a city. So we see a patchwork of inconsistency where states and cities can work together, but in some instances they're certainly not.
Well, given that, how can someone in your line of work be most effective then as it relates to advancing the sustainability desires of urban centers?
Well, I'd like to think in a few ways. One, uh, sustainability is a topic that really resonates within the business community. And so we have a common language and some best practices and challenges that we've tackled. And we find that we're often able to talk to city sustainability officers and city leaders about challenges that we are facing together. The health, the livability, the viability of a city is as important to a business as it is to the city government, particularly if the business has employees there and operations there. So we really have a lot in common in solving their problems, and oftentimes we have common problems. My company in particular is a global company. We're in about 190 countries, and we have 390,000 employees worldwide. That means we've worked in and with cities for a long time. So we often have best practice examples that may come from another country that we can share with a city, let's say in the United States, where we can give them an example of a similar challenge that another city faced, and we happen to know about how they went about that. So it's knitting together a network of expertise, a common language, all wrapped in the fact that we have a very common desire to see cities become more sustainable.
Can you expand on that and give us an example of something that has been applied in that way, where we've brought solutions from, say, outside the United States or outside North America and successfully applied those here?
I think some of the examples come from areas that are struggling with their transportation needs, for instance. So there was a city in India that was trying to figure out how they could rebuild or build anew a modern train hub. They needed this for their transportation purposes. Their structure was literally crumbling, and they really didn't have a ready source of financial assistance to get that particular building constructed. And so they decided to go to the private sector and to offer the private sector a stake in creating a modern transportation hub for rail transportation. And so they actually gave the land to the private sector, and the private sector provided expertise and constructed the train station. We've used that example in talking to a variety of cities about how they might be able to construct public-private partnerships, given the fact that a lot of cities hold on to very valuable land, and they don't necessarily have sometimes the expertise or the cash to construct something that they want to construct on the land. So we've been supplying some examples such as those that have worked far away, and cities are thinking more creatively about some of those solutions.
Interesting. Um, I can't think about this topic without asking about specifically the region that we refer to as the Rust Belt. And those of us who are advocates in the sustainability arena are just itching to see some sort of critical mass take hold in the Rust Belt, so that all of that existing built environment and all of that pent-up energy is put to use in a more sustainable model going forward. What do you see for that part of our region, and is it realistic for us to expect to see big changes?
I think that you'll find when we talk a little bit about what we discovered in our Green City Index, for instance, that there's more progress happening in the Rust Belt than a lot of us realize. There's a certain understanding that long-term planning, which may not sound as green as it does in some other cities, but long-term planning is essential, particularly for cities that are really facing serious financial issues. And long-term planning includes planning for natural disasters, which many of cities in the Rust Belt have suffered, droughts, floods, etc. But it also entails looking at how to bring a city back to life so that the tax base wants to stay there, move there, businesses want to locate there. So there's actually a fair amount that we see cities in the Rust Belt doing without needing a lot of cash. They're getting their communities excited about wellness programs. They're getting their communities excited about recycling, particularly at large athletic events. They're learning about these things. They're finding ways to engage the private sector, for instance, in performance contracting, which means an energy company can guarantee energy savings to the city and actually stand behind that guarantee so that the city can get cash to invest capital in buildings and make those more energy efficient. We see that happening a fair amount in that area. So I think there is a lot of progress, and maybe as much as you would see in some of the cities where you would think there's less to do. I think that the Rust Belt is definitely catching up.
Interesting. Well, you mentioned the Green Cities Index, so I'll give you a chance to walk us through that a little bit and help us understand that better.
Well, this is an example of our attempt. We started this in Europe, actually, to survey cities, what they're doing with respect to sustainability, and this was really more focused on environmental sustainability, and to provide a report, a credible report, researched by the Economist Intelligence Unit to the cities for their use to compare best practices and ideas from around the world. to be honest, as a business, we weren't certain when we put the first report out about cities in Europe whether the cities that weren't at the top of the index would be happy with us. But as it turns out, and as we've moved around the world and done these indices in various continents, this idea has been very well received. Cities got a little bit competitive and said they wanted to do better next time and beat their competitor city. But I think more important, they wanted to dive into the report and see what other cities are doing and how they might be able to solve some similar problems. So it's been a very useful tool, which is why we put it together to begin with. Um, our methodology was very statistically developed by the Economist Intelligence Unit and a panel of experts, outside experts, so not Siemens. And the data was collected from public sources using the most recent data available because we thought that would be the most transparent way to put together the index. And we did get cooperation from each of the cities in the index in order to get that data. These are the cities in the U.S. and Canada on the next slide here that we studied for the U.S.-Canada Green City Index. They were selected based on population. So there are obviously a lot of really interesting cities that are doing very, very interesting things that we didn't include in this particular index. We looked at the biggest cities, top 20 biggest cities in the U.S. and the top 5 in Canada, and we compared those. And we compared them, in the next slide, we compared them on 9 indicators, and we really broke those down into sub-indicator categories as well. And these indicators changed a little bit from continent to continent because some indicators are more important or there's more data for them in other parts of the world. The U.S. and Canada, I'll just add, was a little more of a challenge in terms of getting data than we anticipated. We thought with the regulation that's in place here, more so than in other areas of the world, we would probably have more robust data. But we found that a lot of cities are challenged, particularly in getting data from the private sector. So let's say privately owned buildings. And so they don't have a very clear picture of the energy usage of the buildings within their city boundaries. Some do if they've got great cooperation with their utility or if they happen to own their utility like LA, but other cities are really still struggling to put that together. And despite the fact that we have pretty well recognized protocols for determining greenhouse gas emissions, a number of cities are still putting that data together as well. And this is one area, Ron, where I would say there was a difference in the Rust Belt cities versus cities that have been doing this for a long time, like San Francisco or New York. The cities in the middle of the country tend to be still a little behind in developing that data. They don't have robust staff to put that together, or perhaps they've had a change of administration time after time, and there hasn't been continuity in an environmental program. By the way, these slides will be available to everyone, so you can look at some of the detail on these slides about the indicators that we used later, or of course I'll take questions. This is the outcome of the index. The 27 cities overall and the way they stacked up are on the left side. San Francisco's at the top, and what's really telling is the difference between the score of San Francisco at the top and the score of Detroit, St. Louis, and Cleveland at the bottom. So there's quite a large difference there. And across the slide, you can see how the top 10 cities stacked up, and every now and then they were tied in the categories of carbon dioxide emissions, energy efficiency, land use, building efficiency, transportation, water, waste, air, and environmental governance. And that last category, by the way, is not just whether they have a sustainability program in place, but whether it has teeth, whether it has enforcement behind it as well as transparent reporting and tracking, particularly perhaps on an annual basis. Plan NYC is a very good example of that. So some of our overall impressions from the indices around the world is that wealth certainly helps. The cities that have a pretty high per capita GDP tend to be performing pretty well in this index. It obviously allows different choices for cities and individuals. Compare U.S. cities to cities in the developing world where clean water and provision of energy is a baseline issue and certainly not a guarantee to the majority of the population versus in the U.S., where the differences tend to break down on aging infrastructure and how wealthy a city is and able to replace that infrastructure. But effective planning seemed to be the real distinguishing indicator that we found. So where a city had been, and San Francisco is a great example of this, carrying out environmental programs, whether they were called sustainability or something else, for a number of years, in San Francisco's case, about 15 years, there was certainly a very high level of performance. That continuity really made a difference. The coordination is possible. There's a comprehensive perspective, not just problem solving in a certain area, but a understanding of the connection between transportation emissions and the overall CO2 emissions of the city, for instance. There was good communication, which means the citizenry is pitching in to help or pressuring the city leaders to be more sustainable. Early adoption certainly shows in the results. The longer a program's been running, the more successful it's likely to be, or it's been retooled. And strong institutions certainly beget consistent green action. And where you have a voter base that's very oriented to livability, walkability, wellness, as well as greenhouse gas emissions and being good stewards of the environment, there tends to be a city governance that responds. So there are lots of paths to success. New York, Vancouver, Denver, and LA were all near the top of the index. They're obviously very different cities. Some of them, when the index came out, pointed the finger at one another and said, well, you've got it a lot easier because your geography allows for better air emissions conditions, for instance. The inversion issues in Denver and other areas of the Utah, other areas of the index were certainly factors, I think, that were hard to take into account within the index, and that certainly affects the city's ability to reduce its pollution. Wealthier cities on both coasts ranked near the top, and the Canadian cities ranked a little higher than expected because actually their average GDP is a little bit lower compared to the U.S. cities. And then just one last recap. What we learned in specific from the U.S. and Canada is that the U.S. and Canada compared to the other indices, so the other continents around the world, fare pretty well in water infrastructure, recycling, and environmental governance. Even though aging water infrastructure is a very big issue for a lot of cities in the U.S. in particular, the water infrastructure systems in the U.S. are not nearly as old as they are in other places around the world, or perhaps they're not even developed in other places around the world. So it's a big issue here, but a bigger issue, and leakage is a very substantial issue elsewhere in the world. Recycling programs tend to go with wealth and cooperation, and so a number of areas in the world have not even started any type of recycling program versus San Francisco, which has a composting program and diverts the vast majority of its waste away from landfills. Environmental governance, because we have a system of regulation, cities are able to pass ordinances and are able to rely on state regulations as well. They tend to have a more structured plan for sustainability than a lot of the other cities in the world. The history of urban sustainability and environmentalism is relatively long in the U.S. and Canada, and the private sector is certainly engaged in sustainability in the U.S. and Canada as well. But compared to the rest of the world, our carbon dioxide emissions are relatively high. Our electricity usage is very high. Obviously, we rely on cars more than a lot of other societies. Not only do we have them, but we don't have the same public transportation system designed for moving people that other areas like Europe have. Our water usage, despite our relatively healthy water infrastructure, the amount of water we use is very high compared to other areas of the world. And urban sprawl, which has a great deal to do with our transportation policies, is also something relatively unique to the United States. So Ron, those are some of the general themes we gained from the Green City Index. And as I said, it's been a very useful conversation tool as we talk to cities and they frequently ask us, what do we see around the world and how can we give them examples of what they could do? The report has a separate page, or several pages really, on each one of the cities in the index. So it really lays out a lot of what the city is doing in each of the areas: energy, CO2 emissions, transportation, etc.
Very interesting. Would Would you mind if I ask, were there any other specific surprises that leapt out as you assembled this? You mentioned a couple of things that were somewhat unexpected, but what would you say is the biggest surprise that you found in the data?
I think a lot of people, well, one of the surprises I did mention is in putting it together, we were surprised at the lack of data. And particularly the fact that we had to go back to relatively old data, actually in the early 2000s, in order to fairly compare each city with respect to their greenhouse gas emissions. So cities had not been using the same methodology, even though some of them have really put in place aggressive greenhouse gas reduction goals. They were using all different kinds of methodologies to measure their emissions, which meant it was very hard to compare one city to the other to the other. So to get to a common methodology that had been used to map greenhouse gas emissions for these cities, we had to go back to a university study that was done some years ago. Cities didn't like that. They knew that they'd made more progress than the early 2000s, but it was a surprise to us to find that they were kind of all over the map in the way they'd been measuring their emissions. I think the fact that New York was number 3 overall was a surprise to a lot of people who don't necessarily think of New York as green. But New York has a very aggressive and one of the front-runner programs in sustainability called Plan YC. It's been in place for a while. There's annual reporting. They really put stretch goals out there and they measure themselves against the goals. They're ahead of themselves for a lot of their goals, like the number of trees they wanted to plant. And the fact that there's a central park in New York, which really gave them a great land use score because they have a dedicated green space, in addition to the fact that so many people utilize public transportation in that highly dense environment, really put them toward the top of that index.
Hmm. Is it safe to assume that there was some sort of sliding scale that helped to compensate for differences in climate zone and elevation and other factors like geography?
There wasn't a sliding scale. There are some qualitative as well as quantitative measurements going back to that detailed pie chart. So some of the ways in which the cities were ranked was just using the same methodology. What's your number for your SO2 emissions? What's your number for water usage? And then there was a qualitative piece of each one of those indicators that the Economist Intelligence Unit used on a 1 to 10 sliding scale of judgment to assign to each one of the cities as well. So there was a qualitative component, but some of the cities thought that that needed to be a little more detailed in our next index. We've learned from putting together this index from our city's response to it as well. And I also think that if we do this again, which we do intend to do in about a year and a half, we'll certainly see a more robust database as well.
When we think of this subject at a macro level, you know, it's been our experience that any organization, whether it's a governmental body at whatever level, whether it's an NGO or a private company or a corporation or any kind of organization, what we found is that there are, in every instance, there are champions of sustainability, and then there are those who are less interested. And one of the you mentioned communication as being one of the keys. What we found is that there is always a sort of a group of people who aren't even aware of each other, and they're all in their sort of private initiatives or in their smaller efforts, and when we go in and talk with them and we sort of make everybody sit down and converse with each other, they're surprised to learn that there are so many like-minded people, or there are other initiatives within the organization that they didn't even know about. Is that consistent with what you've found in these city governments?
It is. It's a common issue that business faces as well. So this is an area where we almost always nod our heads and reach common ground when talking to a city sustainability officer, for instance. We call it the silo problem. So within a city, oftentimes there's a transportation agency, maybe another agency that deals exclusively with water treatment. There's the mayor's office. There are various silos, and they vary from city to city, obviously, and they don't tend to talk to one another or plan with one another. They have individual goals, they have individual financing issues, and there's often not anyone really forcing them to talk together except periodically on maybe a particular response to a disaster or issue within a city. What's different now that sustainability officers are in place and sustainability planning is taking place is that those agencies are being forced to come together and to see themselves as an integral part of the progress toward reaching the goals in those plans. In fact, if done right, those agencies should be very involved in creating those goals as well and pushed to create stretch goals. Um, that's been a real change in the dynamic of the way the city works. And it's been a challenge, but it's a tremendous opportunity for a city to more efficiently operate, to respond more quickly to problems, but also more importantly, to plan for future growth and development and infrastructure changes in a more comprehensive and sensible way. We have the same dynamic in a large global corporation where not only do we have country structures, but we have structures around each one of our diverse portfolio of businesses. We have a wind energy business. We have a healthcare imaging business. You may think they have nothing to do with one another, and oftentimes they think they have nothing to do with one another, but knitting together overarching goals that we will all be pursuing as a company to become a more sustainable company financially, as well as in terms of how we use our resources and how we treat our employees. It's really an imperative, and it's a different way of doing business for us as well.
Hmm. How do you translate that integration that you just described into business opportunity for Siemens?
Well, we find that when we're talking to a food and beverage company, let's say, or when we're talking to a city, and they're looking at sustainability goals of their own, they are being forced to look at their entire enterprise. And as a company, when we're talking to that customer, we should be more oriented to looking at their entire enterprise as well. But a large company such as ours is more accustomed to talking to a particular customer about a particular product. One of my examples is in the healthcare area. Healthcare imaging equipment is typically installed in a hospital. It's very energy intensive, although we've been developing energy efficient healthcare imaging equipment. It's part of, undoubtedly, a hospital's energy usage picture. For many years, hospitals didn't focus so much on those kinds of operational issues. They were certainly more focused and will remain focused on patient care. But more recently, we're learning that hospitals are really looking at the bottom line benefits of energy efficiency. And they're also seeing that some of the megatrends like climate change are important trends for them to watch because healthcare, preventative diseases, new challenges to their patient base are all a part of what they're looking at associated with climate change. So rather than going into a hospital as Siemens and talking to that hospital about a piece of imaging equipment and then going home, we're recognizing this hospital is also trying to green its facilities. It's trying to make its hospital structure more energy efficient. So we may be passing through a corridor with big signs that say this hospital is expanding and our new expansion is going to be LEED Gold. And that's something that we as a company need to be able to respond to. That's another part of our business. We do a lot of energy assessments and building technology work for our customers, and we need to figure a better way to be more comprehensive in the way we talk to that customer, not just about its imaging equipment and not just about the energy aspects of its imaging equipment, but also about its building and its structure and how those all fit together. We're forced to have a more enterprise-oriented view for our customer, and that's a good thing.
How much do you have to focus on emerging regulation, for example, as a guide to direction for future business? Is it something that is a major factor in your operation?
It depends on where. It is a major factor more so in Europe, and that's just the reality of the pace at which regulation moves through the European Commission and the systems there, as opposed to the pace that has been occurring in the United States. Europe has been leading the way in a number of the environmental regulations, particularly with response to materials, hazardous waste, and even design of products. And we anticipate that the U.S. we know the U.S. is looking at and watching all of those regulations. We anticipate that the U.S. could be moving in that direction as well. So I would say our attention on the more cutting edge, are we in the right place with respect to the design of our products and what we're putting on the market is probably happening more in a European market. If your narrow question is how are we looking at regulation? But of course, it doesn't make a lot of sense for us to develop entirely different products for entirely different areas of the world. So we're probably more focused on what's happening in the more fast-moving areas like Europe than we are here. Here, we're certainly focused on regulations like the greenhouse gas regulation. We do have an energy business, and we serve existing power plants, and we can serve the emerging markets of wind. Certainly, we have quite a lot happening in wind more recently in the United States as well. And so something like the production tax credit, which certainly affected the wind market and has now expired, is something that has affected our business, and we've anticipated and modeled around those changes for quite some time.
If you were to, and I guess I'm not trying to probe for specific winners and losers, but if you were to look into a crystal ball and give us an idea about where you see some emerging opportunities, technologies, bright spots around sustainability for cities, what do you see on the horizon?
I think what we see and then what we also hear from our city customers is a real interest in smart grid technologies. And that's really technologies that integrate various technologies associated with the electricity grid. So there's not one smart grid technology, but quite a few. Cities are very interested as they look at replacement of infrastructure and replacing infrastructure that gives them more information, that they're more easily able to change and respond to from centralized locations. And this could have applications in transportation flow, traffic flow, could have applications in detecting leaks along their water system, or even reading meters virtually without having to have meter readers riding around. There's certainly a great deal of interest in demand response types of technologies. So how can they get more information to the consumer, but also gather more information to the consumer in the electricity context to help to adjust need demand in different times of day or areas of the city. And that, of course, requires cooperation between the city and the utilities as well. But cities are very interested in having that information. So we hear a lot about smart and about data, and also some concerns about what to do with all the data. So cities need help with analytics that they can utilize the data in ways that are most useful for a city making decisions. Another thing we see associated with that is cities are very interested in putting more data out to the public. They want the citizens to have the information they need. The citizens are asking for that because they're accustomed to finding a lot of information on the internet now, and they're wanting their citizens to be a little more empowered to make decisions. Um, I've heard from a couple of sustainability officers recently and those who are facing a political change, a change in the administration in their city, that they're thinking about how to sustain sustainability. And they realize that the best way to do that is to have a citizenry, the people who live in the city themselves, demanding that whomever is in the mayor's office continue to drive forward on sustainability. And they realize the best tool they have to empower and excite that population is information. So they're really looking at technologies that can provide the citizens and the government that kind of information.
Let's talk a minute about the development model. And, I think one of the greatest differences between the European model and the North American model is that, as I had it described to me one time by a CEO of a large European company, that we undervalue our land in North America. But uh, when we think about the development model that we have seen historically in North America, there's an old adage that people really dislike two things. They dislike density and they dislike sprawl. Yet we find ourselves making a choice between those two. Where is the middle ground? If you were putting yourself in the place and the mindset of an urban government leader, and you had to try to find some sort of balance between generating tax revenues through development and being able to um, attain your sustainability goals. That seems like a huge challenge. And how can individuals and like yourself and organizations like Siemens help to determine the outcome of that problem?
Well, we see a lot of planning focusing around, I'll call them hubs, although they're called lots of different things, where an area of development may not be right in the center of the most populated area of the region, but it's an area that businesses can locate in, residential development can take place, schools, other types of amenities can be present. They may not be now, but the plan is for that to occur. And they're linked through, and this is the key, they're linked through a publicly accessible transportation route to other hubs and maybe even the center of the city. So we find that where suburbs have sprung up and strip malls or large malls sort of are the hallmark of that area, that what developers and city officials alike are beginning to realize is they can build around those areas that are already drawing people, and they can typically make them more dense because they're going to add residential, they're going to add services as well. But the key is they then link them through transportation to other of these suburban hubs or the city, the center of the city, and then they've created an environment where if you're in the hub, you can walk to your amenities. You don't have to get in your car, but you can also more easily get to other areas in the region and access those services and those areas of the regions as well. That's certainly happening in the Washington, D.C. area. It's happening in a lot of areas where a city center may have decayed for a while and suburban areas grew more rapidly. Now the challenge as a city planner is to link them together. I think that is a hybrid model. And it more or less avoids going out and creating completely new development in greenfield. You are perhaps increasing the density of a suburban area, but you're increasing it for multiple uses.
That segues very nicely into another question I want to ask you, but first I want to tee up Mike and say, let me ask one more question, Mike, and then I would see if you have some questions of your own or from those in attendance.
Certainly.
Allison, we talked earlier about the Rust Belt, and I see indications, in bits and pieces that there seems to be a bit of a reverse migration taking place, where due to weather patterns, long range weather indicators and other factors, that that companies that may have migrated into more the southeastern part of the country and so forth, some of those entities are looking back toward the Great Lakes region and other parts of the Midwest. Am I imagining that, or do you see evidence of that as well?
We've seen evidence of that, although I don't have any statistical data off the top of my head, but we were having an informal conversation about this recently within our company. The observation we're making is that that trend is more likely and I think positively linked to manufacturing. So there has been, because of natural gas prices for one reason, a resurgence and an interest in manufacturing in the United States. And what's also exciting about that manufacturing is a lot of it is very technically advanced, which is new employment opportunities and new training opportunities for people who have previously been out of work in these areas of the country. As we see more manufacturing move maybe from overseas into that area of the country, but also from other areas of the U.S., we see that populations obviously are heading in that direction. City leaders are getting more excited about creating amenities for these businesses, linking them to one another, perhaps putting them in a suburban hub type situation. One thing that we've realized, not necessarily in any particular part of the country, is that our technology manufacturing does tend to be very highly specialized. And the typical skills of a typical factory worker may not really be applicable to the types of manufacturing that we're asking them to do. They may need to know more about software, for instance, than anything else. And so we've had success in partnering with community colleges to put together programs to train the local people who may be already out of work or who may be young people just getting out of high school to learn these very specific skills. They don't necessarily have to come to work for us. They'll have a degree from the community college that they could take anywhere. But we're finding that a lot of companies, particularly technology companies, are not finding those types of skills in the worker base. And when we are able to put resources into the community, like a community college, then that increases employment in the area. More people move in. They want to take advantage of those programs. Obviously, we're able to find more local employees. That's important to us. And that's a way that we're seeing the possibilities of really reinvigorating those pockets of manufacturing around the country.
Interesting. At this point, let me defer to Mike, and perhaps he can bring in some fresh questions for us.
Thank you, Ron. I appreciate it. And I would remind our audience to go ahead and use the Q&A box to submit any questions you may have. I will be sure to pass them along to Allison as we go along here. I did have one of my own, Allison. I'm a resident of the Midwest, just near St. Louis, and people here don't really get the severity of the water issue and water scarcity. How would you suggest raising the importance of water conservation in an area where it doesn't seem to have a lot of importance?
Yeah. Well, it is a difficult issue because water remains relatively inexpensive. And so long as people are not particularly concerned about the size of their water bills, they tend to think that this is a resource they can use as frequently as they want. I think that there are cities that have done very effective communication on this point. They're fairly easy tools to measure the amount of water that the city is utilizing as well as neighborhoods and individuals. And so a lot of times it's just education. Um, we've even worked with cities to put together an online tool, and this was available in airports in a few cities as well, where people could answer simple questions. How many showers do you take? How long is your typical shower? Do you wash dishes in a dishwasher? Do you wash them every day, etc., to give people the ability to calculate their own water usage. And with the widespread use of apps and the internet, that type of information could be better distributed. A lot of people who I watched play that game and go through the questionnaire in the airports were really surprised at the end at how much water they used. And we try to give them comparisons to something that, they can think about in a real scale and realize, wow, I used, a certain percentage of Niagara Falls or something like that. So I think information is key. We also know some great programs around the country where cities have basically given away not only education but also pretty simple devices that can be installed on shower heads or in toilets to help to conserve water. Of course, you have to have a consumer, even though they're getting it for free, interested in applying that kind of technology, as simple as it is. But I think that once one neighbor does and saves on their water bill and talks about it, that tends to be a good way for kind of grassroots efforts to bloom and to grow. On a bigger scale, certainly cities can do a fair amount to conserve energy and conserve water by providing some upgrades and updates to their infrastructure system. What we find a lot of times is when they do that, they don't necessarily communicate that back to their constituency, to the citizenry, and explain to them how they're going to be saving overall, particularly on the city's energy bill. A tremendous amount of dollars is tied up in treating water. So I think my overall suggestion is communication, and particularly communication about how simple it can be to conserve water.
And I think that pricing component is so critical as well, simply because I think that's one of the chief points of resistance is, well, where's the return on investment? If I go and put in a stormwater management system or a stormwater retention system, it's going to take so long to get that payback. And as a personal, uh, from my personal standpoint, water is a big issue with me, and I always think of it as it's much bigger than that. But some people they look at it in much more black and white context.
Right, and cities that have been through something like drought, certainly they understand when they've had to restrict water usage, when they've had to stop people from watering their lawns. That's one way to get information out. Of course, it's less well received. It's a negative situation, but that also tends to awaken people to the issue that this is not a resource that they can necessarily count on. That no matter where you come down on the issue of global warming or climate change, you nevertheless have to embrace the fact that you cannot control nature, and you may have to change your own habits in order to accommodate changes that are happening in the environment. And we certainly see more examples of that, California being an example of that right now.
We have a question from Sarah. She wanted to know, how can builders and architects, whether they're in a leading city on the index or a struggling city, how can they apply the information that they get from this wealth of information in the index? How can they apply that to their business practices?
Well, we saw a really great idea, and I'm not sure that we've published it in the index because we may have found out about it afterward, actually. But Atlanta had this great idea. It paired smaller businesses within the core downtown area, midtown area of Atlanta with energy service providers of a variety. It may be the people who can come and assess the energy usage in your building. It may be the people who could install a different HVAC system, whatever. They did sort of a speed dating kind of format where they would have the businesses kind of sit in one place and different providers rotate around to talk to them. And at the end, the businesses took a pledge to assess their energy usage within their buildings. And oftentimes this meant they really had to work with their landlords. That's a very big challenge. And so the city was able to recognize improvements after a while because not only were the assessments done, but a number of the businesses invested in different types of capital improvements to improve their energy efficiency. But this was all sponsored by the city, and the invitations came from the city. And a lot of these businesses never would have talked to these different idea providers, the city not put this together. We're seeing that cities are putting together overall goals for their reduction in energy usage, and they're trying a number of creative things, particularly to engage the private sector. They have control over their municipal buildings by and large, but engaging the private sector is their biggest challenge. I think that the struggle that particularly very dense cities have is that a great deal of their buildings are owned by the private sector. They don't have any control over them necessarily, even those that put LEED requirements and others on new building. Um, and if you're a tenant in a building that obviously you don't own, then you have to somehow band together to persuade your landlord, the owner of the building, that it's worth that company's while to install energy efficiency measures within the building, and the landlord may not see the real value of that, particularly if the tenant gets the energy savings. So that's a tension that I think a number of cities have navigated. They've required, for instance, energy assessments on anything that's a new building. So in the next 5 years or 10-year cycle, you have to perform an energy assessment in addition to having constructed your building according to LEED standard of some sort. Um, some have gone at it a different way, kind of more competitive. So this building can earn a energy label recognized by the city as a very energy efficient building if it meets certain criteria, and they are incentivizing the businesses within their city ranks to compete for those labels. So it's a difficult dilemma where you have a large stock of, as most cities do, privately owned buildings. But another angle I've seen is that some of the larger real estate companies that manage or own a lot of building stock within cities have their own sustainability goals. And they're even now negotiating contracts with their tenants to have a certain financial incentive if the owner comes up with ways that the tenant can conserve energy. So there's more discussion happening, but that tends to be, I've noticed, where the management or the ownership companies are fairly large, and they're being watched by the public, and they feel a need to be more out front in their own sustainability story.
Sure. We have a question from Rodney. He wanted to know, do you ever face resistance when taking an idea from one country and trying to apply it to another country's city?
um, Well, I'm sure we do. We're not a regulator, so all we would do is make a suggestion, I guess. Um, well, I guess a pretty good example of that might be high-speed rail. We have a robust business in high-speed rail in Europe, in particular. We're one of the leading providers of the rail cars and locomotives in Europe, and we don't have any ability to impose that on the market in the United States, but we have had a great deal of resistance, I think we would say, at many levels in really getting high-speed rail off the ground in the United States. So I guess that's actually a pretty good example of a big difference between Europe and here.
Okay. Um, I apologize if I missed it. When it came to evaluating cities, does the Green City Index look at just like the city limits or the overall metropolitan area?
It does look at the metropolitan area, the metropolitan statistical area. That's how we found was most fair to compare the cities because that's the way in which the most robust and credible data is compiled, particularly by regulators. So that is the way that this particular index was constructed.
Gotcha. Okay. And I had a question from Matthew. You were talking about the smart grid, and you mentioned that there were a few different technologies. Are these able to talk to one another? And if not, are we going to face issues down the road with compatibility?
The point is that they are supposed to talk to one another, but that is a very good point because if they don't talk to one another or if there's a replacement of some piece or part of the integrated system that isn't compatible with the rest of the system, then there certainly would be a problem. And I think the design of the technologies, I'm not just speaking for Siemens, is certainly around compatibility. So the situation is not such that one technology would have to be procured by the same company in order to be compatible. I think that the real challenge is many of the aging infrastructure systems, be it the grid or a water infrastructure system within a city, it could be so vast that putting smart technologies onto an aging system may not be the smartest thing to do, or it may even be very difficult or impossible. So I think that's a real challenge that we still face from a technology point of view, not to mention the money that may be required, more so than the compatibility.
Well, that's all the questions that I have from both myself and the audience. So, Ron, I'm going to hand it back over to you to wrap it up.
Well, thank you, Mike. And Allison, I have to say, I've had one of those Ginger Rogers moments here. We've danced you all over the floor, and you've been very adept and articulate, no matter what the rhythm or the dance step is. But it's clear that you really know what you're talking about, and it's been an enlightening hour for me, particularly. So I wonder if you'd give us just a final thought that we can take away from our session here, and I'll let you do that. And I will say in advance, thank you very much for a great exchange.
Well, thank you. I've really enjoyed it, and maybe you can tell cities is one of my favorite topics. I think that the way in which cities have stepped into the void, particularly in the United States, to take the lead on sustainability, to figure out ways to creatively finance solutions and to motivate the people within the cities without using a whole lot of money because they don't have a lot, is really not only terrifically inspiring, but there's also great examples for the rest of the world and other governments as well. I think one of the more interesting and dynamic things about a city, as I said before, is how quickly decisions get made and how quickly the people within a city react to those decisions, whether they like them or they don't. And so there's a lot to learn from cities, from a company as well, from our point of view. It's really an incubator for technologies for us. What takes, what's responded to, what worked, what was too much, what was too little. You can get a very fast reaction to that from a city. And I think the greatest challenge that cities will face, with those especially that have made tremendous progress and have great plans in place, is sustaining that momentum. Once they are a lot more energy efficient, let's say, it becomes more difficult to find the next source of greater efficiency, and businesses certainly face that as well. And that's where real transformational changes can take place beyond the low-hanging fruit changes. The real transformational changes will take a very engaged public in particular, really demanding that those changes take place. So I think it's a very exciting time, and it's going to continue to be exciting as we see bigger changes in cities happening.
Thank you, Mike. I'll let you take us away then.
Well, thank you, sir. I wanted to take one more opportunity to thank our sponsor, the Green Builder Coalition, and I also wanted to thank all of you for joining us today. Finally, I want to express my gratitude to Allison for taking the time to share your insights with us. It was quite enjoyable. We hope you'll join us next time for another edition of Impact Series, Game Changers in Sustainability. The Green Builder Media team is working hard to finalize details on a webinar for next month, and we also have our sights set on another one for March, so details will be coming soon. In the meantime, in case you're snowed in or iced in or whatever it is that you may be facing today, I wanted to remind you that we have a number of archived webinars on the Green Builder Media site. Uh, Simply go to the Impact Series tab, and you'll notice there will be a small drop-down that will say Archived Webinars. There's quite a few of them over the past year, um, a variety of topics, and all of them I think are worth your time. We thank you again for joining us today. Take care, and we'll talk to you all again soon.